And good afternoon once again. It is the Carolina Geek Podcast. I am your host, John Thomas Hill. And I wanted to kind of take a moment to just do another podcast because I'm slowly starting to get things back to going on this group as well as other things. Quick little update on some personal stuff. I am starting back again at working on my novel. It's not so easy because I've been going at this thing for 8 years, and it's very, very tough because the first one is rather extensive. I built a very extensive universe, and trying to build onto that is not as easy as I thought. So yeah, good thing it's a hobby. On this episode, I wanted to talk about what I consider to be the holy trinity of science fiction television. It's probably not yours. You'll probably disagree with it, and that's perfectly fine. This is personal for me, and I'm not here to debate this because it's personal for myself alone. I fully understand if your favorites are in the Star Trek universe, or you're partial to Firefly, or Farscape, or The Expanse, or any other shows. These are the three to me that mean the most to me personally. Now, two of those you probably know right off the bat, Babylon 5, and most of you probably know Battlestar Galactica pretty well. The third one, and the first in this order, is a little known but very important show. There was an animated cartoon called Star Blazers that it came out in America in 1979, but it actually debuted 5 years earlier in Japan, known as Space Battleship Yamato, and it became very popular there. Now, the interesting part about Star Blazers is it's basically a Americanized version of the show. It was meant mainly for kids, but more along the lines of older children, not necessarily young kids. It was action adventure. But in Japan, it was much more violent. You actually saw people dying in the cartoon over there, whereas in Star Blazers you didn't. They basically quote-unquote sanitized it for American audiences. One of the things, if you ever watch the show, and you can find it on YouTube, I believe you can still find it on YouTube. You do have to do some searching. And this is to differentiate from the one that's coming out now in anime on Funimation. That is more kind of a reboot that is more in tune with the original in Japan. They use the Japanese names, and I'm going to get to that, how I feel about that in a minute. They Americanized it by making the Americanized names for the characters. The Japanese name for the lead character is Susumu Kodai, whereas in America it's Derek Wildstar. And there is some debate about this, and to me, I believe that personally, and not everyone's going to agree with me, that Star Blazers should be for the Americanized names, and Space Battleship Yamato should be for the Japanese names. That's just me. I've tried watching the new one. It gets confusing because I'm not so familiar with the Japanese version. I think that if they ever did an American version of it, they should do a mixture and maybe expand the cast some more. I'll get to more of that. Actually, I'm going to talk about it for a moment because not too long ago, well, actually, I'd say maybe a few years back, I actually dabbled with the idea of doing a novelization, a fan fiction novelization of the entire first and second series. And it's been something I've thought about doing for quite a long time, but I actually was a while back when I was still looking for a job. This is 2014 or so, and you're trying to keep you're out of work and you're desperately looking for a job, and you're trying to keep your head on. So yeah, you do what you got to do. And I was looking into that, and nothing ever came of it because I was more focused on my original work at the time, including the novel I talked about earlier. Star Blazers was different from many other cartoon shows and many other television shows at the time because you had a season-long arc, a season-long story. And mainly because of this, it's different from a lot of television shows in America at the time, because television shows in America at the time tended to be episodic, in which the cast of characters pretty much remains the same throughout the entire series. The situation pretty much stays the same. The stories would basically have a beginning, middle, and end in that particular episode. You wouldn't see any of the elements go over to other episodes. You might see character traits. Maybe a character goes from middle school to high school, or high school to college, or college to the workplace, whatever you want to call it. But that generally was the rule for the most part up until, I would say, 20 years ago. I'd say maybe not even that, 15 years ago, when things started to change a bit. It's still the same in many dramas, many non-genre dramas. Star Blazers brought this to American shores in 1979. Now, this was not exactly unique in America. There had been other attempts for art-driven shows, but because of studio execs believing the audience wasn't as smart as they actually were, and in some cases it's because the studio's execs weren't as smart as they actually were, or alleged to be, the feeling was the audience would not want to have the patience. Now, back then, in 1979, you didn't have streaming media. You didn't have DVDs. You rarely even had VHS tapes. And you certainly didn't have them of cartoon shows that just came on the air. So basically, if you liked a TV show and you wanted to follow the story, you had to be there every single week at that exact same time, or like with this cartoon, every single day at that particular time, Monday through Friday. And for me, I had to literally rush off the bus, get home, and turn on the TV and get there just at 3:30 when it came on WCCB Channel 18 out of Charlotte. Now, the main impact of arc-driven shows is that it demands the audience pay attention to little minute details. This comes more into Babylon 5, especially Babylon 5, and Battlestar Galactica, the newer one, not the older one. The older one tended to be more along the lines of the episodic version, although they did have a few minor, and it's been a long time since I've seen the original, but Star Blazers was the one thing that kind of made television different for me. Up until that time, I really was not much for either Star Wars or Star Trek. So back then, Star Trek came on every day. I can't remember what channel it came on. I think it may have been 13 out of Asheville. I wasn't a huge fan of it. And Star Wars obviously was a movie, and back then they didn't debut it on VHS. I don't think it came on VHS until 81 or 82, something like that. So if you didn't catch it in the movie theaters, you were out of luck, So Star Blazers was repeated 5 days a week from 1979, the fall of 79, all the way to the fall of 1981. For 2 years, the same cycle of episodes, 26 in the first series called Quest for Iskandar, and I believe 26 for the second series called The Comet Empire. Now, the first one dealt with Earth being attacked by an alien race called the Gamelons. In Japan, they're known as Gamelas. And it kind of changed. The Gamelons went from being blue skin to being human-like, or human-like to blue skin. I can't remember exactly. I gotta rewatch it again. It's been a long time. But to me, the key feature was that the enemy race wasn't entirely, although some of them were evil, seemingly evil, it was Deathlock who changed the perception of what a villain is. He wasn't the evil baddie when you realized, and this is a huge spoiler here, that Gamelon was dying and they had to find a new home. Maybe the way he was doing it was bad, but when you're desperate, you're desperate. And when you look at the humans as being kind of like, creatures, like certain people may have looked at certain other people back in human history. But the interesting part about that was that it humanized the so-called enemy. And there's a line from, I learned years ago from a professional wrestler, I can't remember which name it is, who it was, who said the best kind of villains are the ones who believe they're the good guys. They're the ones that in their mind, they view themselves as the hero. Because even though their agenda may be completely bad and evil and all this, in their mind, they're the good guys. So that's where if you look at it long enough, and I've watched Star Blazers a few times over the years, Deathlock is trying to save his home world. And there's this world that is inhabited by this quote-unquote inferior species. So he's got to go there. Now, why did he have to nuke it straight to hell? I don't know. But that's beside the point. And the story is that the climactic near climactic battle is at Pluto, and Earth is decimated. They're down to one last ship, or so they think. And Gamelon's on the verge of destroying Earth and all this and taking over things for themselves. Well, it turns out that no, they are not the last ship on Earth. They have resurrected the old battleship Yamato from World War II. Yes, it's crazy, I know. That's like resurrecting the Arizona from Pearl Harbor to fly into space. But this was the 70s, and as a little kid I didn't quite understand the entire, what all would be needed to convert a rusting out battleship into a space-worthy craft. But folks, I was interrupted by a phone call. But let me get back to it. Human civilization is being bombed into oblivion. They've went to underground cities. Radiation poisoning is creeping underground, and if they don't find a cure for the year, humanity is dead. And miracle upon miracles, they could get one at Mars. An alien craft crashes there, and they find a capsule that gives them the information to get to a planet called Iskandar, 148,000 light years away. And they have the designs for not just a warp engine to get them there within that period of time, but a major point in the entire franchise, a weapon called a wave motion gun, which is like the mother of all weapons, which makes what the Death Star has look relatively pale, because the Death Star is a huge moon-like object that can destroy a planet. Well, you got this in the battleship. It's a lot smaller. a lot smaller than a moon. Okay, so yeah. To cut to the chase, to get to the near Iskandar, only to find out that the home world of the Gamelon itself, is a twin planet with Iskandar. They're literally orbiting each other in this solar system. So yeah, they have to, in order to get to Iskandar, they got to get through Gamelon, and they do, and they realize that the planet's dying, and in order to fight their way to get to Iskandar, they've got to basically pretty much kill off Gamelon. They don't kill everybody on Gamelon, but they kill a lot of people on Gamelon. This isn't now in the cartoon, Americanized version of the cartoon. You don't realize that, but when you grow up and you watch it again, you realize, yep, a lot of people died. So they get to Iskandar. They take this thing called Cosmo DNA, which is basically a crazy name for a fantastical device that, if all of humanity thinks positive thoughts, will get rid of the radiation. I know it was 1970s. This was a cartoon and all this, but hey, it worked. They got rid of the radiation, and not before the Gamelons and Deathlock, which is the main villain, almost beat them to Earth and almost stopped it right before they got there. But our brave soldiers got through there. But there was, and there's a lot more to that. Captain Gideon, the commanding officer, dies right before they get back to Earth, and all of this. And I'm skipping over a lot. I'm going to go more into depth about this at a later date. I've actually, on other podcasts, I have talked about this, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of that particular one. Now, Comet Empire is a continuation of this, depending on who you talk to. It's either 2000 a year later, 2 years later, or 3 years later. To me, you can't rebuild that fast. So in my novelization, I was actually going to make it 5 years later. Deathlock would have been older. Derek Wildstar would have been older. All the main characters would have been older. And there would have been a new enemy called the Comet Empire. And basically, it's not quite as good as the original, although there's some unique things like the Space Marines, which are led by Sergeant Knox. And they go trying to fight a person named Trelana on the planet Telazart, who is warning Earth about this Comet Empire, and basically, they do beat the Comet Empire in the end, but there's a huge cost. So that's a broad generalization. Like I said, I'm going to get more into this at another date. But the reason primarily Star Blazers is important to me is the fact that it introduced me to arc-driven television, which at the time was unheard of back then in American television. It was not widely seen. In British television, it was more widely seen. In other countries, it was prevalent, but in America, television executives thought that the audience was not as smart as they actually were, and they didn't have the attention span that they actually did. So they felt like, and you also have to remember, they wanted to have reruns in the syndicated market. And so they wanted it to where people can just pick up and watch a show on this day, go 3 or 4 days and watch it again, and not have to worry about people tuning out because, I don't know what's going on in the show and all this. Things have changed. People's viewing habits have changed. We have this word called binging, binge watching nowadays. So television is a lot different than it was even 20 years ago. There was with videotapes, if you have videotaped of shows or later on DVDs, you could binge watch, but you'd have to have physical copies of it. And you'd have to get up, change the DVD, change the tape, and all of this, have huge, massive collections. Whereas now, all you need is a streaming player and accounts on either Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Peacock, CBS All Access, Disney Plus, whatever.
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
Oops. That was Alexa, by the way. Babylon 5. The year is 1993. Star Trek The Next Generation is winding down. It was, for the most part, pretty good. First 2 seasons, not so great. After the 3rd season, did really, really good. And toward the end, it was pretty good, for the most part. But it was episodic. Along comes a man by the name of Joe Straczynski, who, being influenced by Lord of the Rings and books like The Lensman and others, science fiction, decides one day to write a television series called Babylon 5, based on a space station. It was a 5-year story arc, which was unheard of in American television because you were lucky to get a full season order to begin with. Usually in American television you get 13 episodes to prove what you could. Back then it was on 13 episode order, and then if you did well enough you got picked up for the entire season. It was unheard of for anybody to plan out an entire television series for 5 years. He had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Where most television shows, pretty much all television shows up to that point, had a beginning, sort of had an idea where the middle is, and maybe an inkling of maybe how they would wrap up the show in the best case scenario. Babylon 5 was never meant to go beyond 5 seasons, and it almost didn't go beyond 5 seasons. It almost didn't go beyond 4 seasons. I'll get to that story in a little bit, or I may get to that in another podcast. But it had the arc-driven story, like Star Blazers. To my knowledge, Joe Straczynski has never publicly said whether or not he's actually watched Star Blazers. He's older than I am, so he would have been a college student, I think, at the time, when I was watching it as a 10-year-old. So, either that or he was old enough to where he could actually... He was out of college, or I'd have to look up at his bio right offhand. But it would be possible he may have watched it and known about it and forgotten it, but may have had the idea of a story-driven arc from not just that, but other material. So I'm not saying he ripped off Star Blazers or anything like that. He didn't. Although there's one particular thing from the Babylon 5 spin-off Crusade, which we'll get back down later on, that I might have a little issue with. But we'll get back to that at another time. Babylon 5 had its pilot debut in winter of 1993. It was called The Gathering. And it was unique in the fact that it wasn't the utopian version of the future like Star Trek portrayed. But the interesting thing is, it came along the same time as Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which coincidentally was based on a starship space station. If I can get my thinking cap on, it was based on a space station, and it was out in the middle of nowhere, and it wasn't exactly the most hospitable of places. So you get into the controversy here that Babylon 5 fans, and to some degree Deep Space Nine fans, have of this. Is Deep Space Nine a ripoff of Babylon 5? Now, I've never gone into this in depth before. I'm not really going to do it now. I will say this. It probably, to a degree, was. but it's not exactly unique in Hollywood. Could Joe Straczynski go to court and force Paramount or whoever owns the rights to Star Trek Deep Space Nine now, whether it's CBS or Paramount, if they're both the same company? Now, I can't keep up anymore with all these mergers. I doubt it. Because then you would have to go, well, where did Joe Straczynski get the ideas for Babylon 5? So proving it would be impossible. There's a lot of coincidences in this. Because at one time, Joe Straczynski presented his treatment for Babylon 5, his pilot idea for Babylon 5, to Paramount. And it is possible Paramount may have whispered in the ear of Gene Roddenberry at the time, who had not yet died, but was not exactly in the best of health, about this idea. And his successor, Rick Berman, came up with the idea of Deep Space Nine, may have been influenced by the idea of Babylon 5, maybe not necessarily directly, but may have had ideas given to him by Paramount executives to quote-unquote beat Babylon 5 to the punch. So, did Deep Space Nine rip off Babylon 5? That's a tough question, because it may very well be that, yeah, I'm sure they were aware of Babylon 5, but I think they felt like that Babylon 5 wasn't going to make it anyway, because they were not Star Trek. And to most studio executives and most people in the business, they felt like that Star Trek was the only science fiction on television. Or would that change by the end of the decade? So yeah, Babylon 5 came online on television as a weekly TV series in 1994. And that's when the great 5-year story arc began. I'm not going to go into characters or anything like that right now, because down the road I'm going to go more in depth about that. This is basically a broad generalization of the story. The first season, there are a lot of episodic episodes, but you can tell by the way that the show is presented. It's dark, it's edgy. It isn't utopian, but it isn't exactly dystopian either. There's a bunch of different alien races, and there's this background story going on that pieces are being laid, the foundation is being laid for the big story. It's enough to where it'll keep you watching. The second season, which there were some major changes, including the lead actor being changed out. Michael O'Hara was the lead actor in season 1. He unfortunately had some psychological issues that basically precluded him from coming back for season 2, and he was written out of the show. And Bruce Boxleitner came in as Captain John Sheridan. And he finished out the series as the lead character. There is some debate amongst Babylon 5 fandom as to what would have been the better story. The story that was presented, where John Sheridan was the main character in the show, or if Jeffrey Sinclair had stayed on board and been the main character throughout the remainder of the series. Now, some time ago, Joe Straczynski released what he called script books. There are 15 volumes, basically had the scripts for each episode, as well as what would have happened if certain things had changed, like if actors had stayed on board, original ideas for what characters were going to be, blah, 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 blah. Unfortunately, at the time he was releasing it, this was a limited release, by the way, my mom was dying of cancer. So I never got a chance to actually order these things. I've never had a chance to even read any of them. You can't buy them digitally. And if you want to buy them hardcover, you're going to be paying through the nose for them. And while it is tempting, I do watch from time to time on eBay to see if there's anybody that sells one that's somewhat, affordable. Yeah, I'm probably going to be out of luck. I hope one day that Joe Straczynski decides to make this digital to where you can actually buy the copies of it. There are 15 volumes. If you buy all 14, you get the 15th. Which basically... And the reason for that is he didn't want to make this into some kind of franchise like Star Wars and Star Trek, where they're constantly churning out product. It's basically to make a profit. To be perfectly frank, part of the reason I'm not really big into Star Trek and Star Wars is for the simple reason that it's basically a franchise. It's a marketing thing. For Star Wars, it's Disney. For Star Trek, it's Paramount, CBS, whatever. It's about making money. And this is the big deal. Babylon 5, unlike Star Trek and unlike Star Wars, did not really have the overwhelming support of the studio. When Babylon 5 came out, they were part of a syndicated television network called Primetime Entertainment Network that originally was intended to become a competitor like Fox Network was, but never got off the ground because around the same time UPN and WB were about to launch. And strangely enough, it was kind of by the same people who were behind P10. So it kind of fizzled out. It was basically just a marketing thing, or a syndicating marketing thing. They had other shows. They had Kung Fu: The Legend Continues, which lasted for a few seasons. I don't think it lasted as long as Babylon 5. It was basically a sequel to the 1970s show Kung Fu with David Carradine. There was another show called Time Tracks, which was basically a time travel show, which I don't really know much about because I didn't really watch it. I did watch maybe one or two episodes and really didn't care for it. Basically, it was, to put it simply, the lead character goes back in time to find criminals who've gone back in time. He has some unique devices to help him out. It was episodic. Didn't have much of a future, but I wasn't really interested in it. Babylon 5 had the cards stacked against it from pretty much the very beginning. There was no consistency about when it was scheduled. I know that when I was originally started watching it, it was actually available on two different TV stations. One out of the Asheville, Greenville, Spartanburg market. I think it was Channel 21. The other was out of Charlotte, WJZY, Channel 2046. I can't remember exactly when it was shown on Channel 21 out of Asheville. I'm thinking it was Saturday evenings, but I can't remember. I know that JZY out of Charlotte, Channel 46, showed it Saturdays at 7. Because generally they would have that show and Star Trek Star Trek Deep Space Nine right after that, or before they were after that. I think that was the case. They had Deep Space Nine at 8, so I'd watch them back to back, and then they would have a replay of Babylon 5 Sunday nights at 11 o'clock. So if I didn't catch it, if I didn't happen to catch it at Saturday evening, I'd catch it at Sunday. Now, the show pretty much bounced around on a lot of stations. Sometimes it went early in the afternoons on the weekends, sometimes late at night, sometimes really late at night, early morning hours. Like on its last run on Channel 21, it was at Saturday mornings, early Saturday mornings at 2 a.m. Yeah. Not exactly going to build an audience that way, but somehow it did. But after 4 seasons, the syndication network was about to be abandoned completely. And Babylon 5 was about to fold after 4 years, and Joe Straczynski had made plans to go ahead and wrap up the 5-year storyline in 4 years. We're at the last hour. Literally. Almost like the last hour. Not quite literally, but close enough. They would still try to get a 5th season. But they were very close to going, well, this is it. We can't fix this anymore. We might as well go ahead and just settle for 4 seasons. It was a great run while it lasted. Turner Network Television comes along and says, we'll pick up a 5th season. Now, like I said, I'm not going into any detail about storylines and all this. Basically, tell you about the fact that it's an arc-driven show, and you wrapped up a 5-year-long arc-driven show in 4 years. They'd even shot the series finale. They hadn't aired it yet, but they'd shot it all. The final episodes of the 4th season hadn't even aired yet. So, over the summer of 1997, a lot of things had to happen quickly. Joe Straczynski had to come up with Season 5 storylines. And that's why Season 5 did not start all that strongly. And we'll go into that detail at another time. It's just that the show was very good for the first 4 years, and then the 5th season comes along unexpectedly and struggles creatively. It's not that it was bad. It was definitely watchable. It was enjoyable. It's just that you could tell that they had stopped, and then they'd picked up again, and they were not quite up to speed. And throughout all of that, the quality of the show had been great for 4 years. 5th season, the quality of the photography, the quality of the set design was really, really good, consistent. It's just the writing had dipped and didn't really pick back up until the second half of the season. And a lot of that, I think, was the fact that they were really struggling about how do we tell a story that pretty much was already over with. So if you decide to watch Babylon 5, you're going to find yourself looking at the 5th season, being somewhat disappointed to start off with. Understand the circumstances behind it, and you will be able to enjoy it. It gets better towards the end of the final season. But the first half of the final season, it struggles. And I'm gonna take a step back for a moment, because I forgot something in Star Blazers that, to be perfectly honest, is kind of forgettable. You remember I said that there were 2 series? Well, there was actually a third that came out in 1985. And the reason it's forgettable was the first 2 seasons had been done by a company, and I can't remember the name of it right offhand, that had done it and had the same voices, the whole 9 yards, and it was really enjoyable. The 3rd season was done by an outfit. I can't remember the name of it right offhand, because I didn't really do a whole lot of research. I just did this on the spot, basically. Sort of, I can't think of the name of the term. Impromptu speech. The 3rd season struggled because the voices were different, the writing and the Americanization was really awful, the voice direction was awful, the editing was awful. I can't go back and watch it. I've watched it 1 time. The original, the Japanese version was probably really, really good. It's just the way they edited it for the American audience. Unlike the first 2 episodes, it was blatantly obvious. And you have to remember, when I watched the 3rd one, I was in my mid-20s. I found the three series on videotape plus the movies that came out. I won't get into the movies today because they're actually under Space Battleship Yamato. And the voice acting on the third series was not nearly as good as the first two seasons. So there is that, unfortunately. Babylon 5's fifth season wasn't as bad as Star Blazer's third series. It almost got to that point because it struggled right out of the gate, but because of the actors, because of kind of the under the overall storyline, and the fact that the audience understood that, yeah, they were restarting basically and having to get back up to speed, the second half of the season was much better. And I'm going to go into more of the details, like the fact that the very popular Susan Ivanova character left after the fourth season and was replaced by Elizabeth Lockley, who was played by Tracy Scoggins, who did as good of a job as you can expect anybody can do in that situation. And yet, to this day, there are Babylon 5 fans who hate her for the simple reason she replaced Ivanova. But that's how it goes sometimes. So now we go on to Battlestar Galactica, the new one. Not the reboot that's coming up in the Peacock network, which I hope doesn't ever see the light of day, because I think it will be bad. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for those of you who are old enough to remember the original, some of you liked it, some of us didn't. I was 6 years old when it first came on, 6 or 7 or something like that. I think it came on 77, 78. Let me preface what I'm about to say. I do not like disco. I don't like disco clothing. I don't like disco music. I just don't like it. It's a long story. That'll bore you to tears. But it's part of the reason I don't like Buck Rogers and the show that came on in 79, 80 around that time with Gil Gerard and Aaron Gray. I've watched it. It was okay, but it's extremely dated. The original Battlestar Galactica is extremely dated. Some people may enjoy it for a nostalgia perspective. I never really got into the whole storyline of it because I didn't really care for it. And like a lot of shows that was bandied about on syndication networks and all of that over the years, I caught it piecemeal from time to time. Well, 2001 comes along, 9/11 of course, and the world changes. Along comes Battlestar Galactica, the new one. Much darker. And the most amazing thing about this is it comes down to Earth figuratively and towards the end of the show literally. No fancy way out wacky sci-fi costumes on this show. No. Suits and ties, as if these people had just left New York City when the Cylons attacked and New York had just gotten spaceships. The fact that the Battlestar Galactica itself was not a newfangled machine, but an old warship that was about to be retired, was striking. Because of the Cylon attack in the first war, 40 years before, they had made ships like Galactica, which were basically technologically disadvantaged, because if the ones that were advantaged were the ones that were susceptible to Cylon hacking. For those of you who watched the show, you know what I'm talking about. Which basically allowed the Cylons to disable the ships and the fighters and whatnot and destroy them. The interesting part about that show in the post 9/11 era was its dark, edgy bleakness, which turned off some people. It's easy to kind of go, oh, it's just so depressing and all this, until you realize, if you watch Babylon 5, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It may not be the light you want, it may not be the light you need, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, they're going through very bleak times right now, but somewhere along the way they're going to have a finish. It may not be the finish you want. And in Battlestar Galactica's case, a lot of fans didn't like the finale to some degree, and I'll get to that in a moment, and later on in depth. Battlestar Galactica takes the arc-driven and really, for the first 2 seasons especially, nails it. But there was a problem that cropped up in the second season that would plague the show for the third and fourth season. The first season was 13 episodes. And it was compact, it was heavily driven by the arc, the overall story arc, and stayed pretty much on pace, a fast pace, and it did very well. The second season comes along, it's 20 episodes, split into 2 10-season halves, 10 half seasons, 2 10-episode half seasons. This is where they had issues, because they couldn't quite fill enough of the same kind of intensity for 20 episodes as they had for 13. So you noticed dips in the intensity. They had some one-off shows. They had some episodic-like shows that still had some arc in it, but not a whole lot. And that's where it struggled at times, especially in the third season, when they got to New Caprica. And you'll find out. I don't really drop a whole lot of spoilers, but primarily the show's tone stayed the same for the most part. But then, and I'm dropping a huge spoiler here, Kara Thrace, quote unquote, dies. Whether she actually died or not is up to conjecture, but she somehow returns at the end of the third season. Some people believe she's an angel, some people believe she's a Cylon, some people believe she's the old Kara Thrace who just happened to find an old Viper and flew it back to Galactica after supposedly dying. My theory has always been that she actually was picked up by the same people that directed the original Colonials from Kobol all the way to the 12 colonies. That was never explored. The reason you never saw aliens on Battlestar Galactica was that Eddie Olmos, who played Commander William Adama, basically said, if I see aliens on this show, I'm walking. That's the reason. I don't think Ron Moore ever planned on it. This is the first sci-fi show I know of at the time that was strictly about just humans. Yes, there were robots too, but they're not aliens. You didn't see other alien races. Essentially, they were alone in the universe, except for the world called Earth that they were supposed to find. Now, I could go on to talk about all sorts of themes and such. I will say this, though. If you are not really into a lot of the dark edgy stuff, understand that Babylon 5 was edgy and had its dark moments. Battlestar Galactica makes Babylon 5 look like Star Trek. And I'm not joking. It's dark. It's bleak. It gets very heavy. But like I said, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And that was finale. Now, those of us who watched the finale, and I'm dropping a huge, major, gigantic spoiler here, when Kara Thrace jumps Galactica to Earth, our Earth, there's a reason I said our Earth, because there's actually two. One got nuked to hell, because it was the original homeworld of Cylons. That if you watch the series, you'll know. If you haven't, you'll want to find out. And they go over the moon, and there you see Africa, which is allegedly, and has been proved by many scientists to be where human Homo sapiens evolved, depending on what you believe and what you accept as being, like I do, fact. 150,000 years ago, the colonials came to Earth. So did some of the Cylons. You'll find that out in due course. Now, the problem is they should have ended the show with the ship coming to Earth, and that's it. The problem was they landed on Earth and started the slow kind of, let's wind up some storylines and all of this, let's tie some loose ends, blah, 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 blah. And that's when you got people going, Starbuck vanishes. We don't know if she was an angel. We don't know what she was. The best thing they could have done was just leave it an open question, which they sort of did, but didn't. We saw Laura Roslin die. She'd been through the whole series battling cancer. We thought she was cured. Turned out she wasn't. And then she later dies. My thing is, they should have stopped right there when they had that Galactica flying toward Earth, going over the moon, flying to Earth. That should have been the end of the show right there. Leave the possibility that you could possibly have Galactica jumping to modern times on this Earth, or a futuristic Earth, or an Earth 200 years ago. We'll never know. I, in my humble, honest opinion, think that what really hurt the show was the fact that they never had a concise way they were going to finish it. They may have had some ideas. They may have had the idea that Laura's going to die, that Starbuck was going to vanish, that they get to Earth. But they were sort of, and this is one of those situations where I have to explain that Babylon 5 was the rarest of shows, because I don't know of any other show that had a beginning, middle, and end planned out already to begin with. Every other show I've ever known about, unless it was a miniseries or meant to go two seasons maybe, every other show pretty much has a beginning and maybe an idea of how to get to the middle, and maybe some sort of idea if they were to get to an end, what the end might possibly look like, but it would be flexible. Battlestar Galactica started out real strong, had some idea of where it was going to go to the middle, but beginning of the third season and throughout the fourth season, you could tell that they were struggling to figure out where they were going. And now I'm going to tell you my reason why I think that television has to change. We recently saw the end of Supernatural, which I wasn't a fan of, but I know a lot of people were fans of it. The show lasted for 15 seasons or so? That was a rare example of a show that lasted that long, that kept up the quality. I know people who were Walking Dead fans who complain now the show's quality has gone completely downhill. I'm not a fan of that show either. And I firmly believe if that show had ended after 4 seasons or 5 seasons, they probably would be much more well regarded. Game of Thrones had just ended a year or so ago. It was tremendously popular, but the last season killed it. They rushed it to do 6 episodes to get it done. Were basically like 6 mini movies, and the ending left people, and I could go into detail about this because I got to really rewatch it to give you more of a focus, because to me it killed what had been the best show on television. It killed it. And my personal feeling is any show that starts out should never go beyond 4 or 5 seasons. At all. Have a beginning, have a middle, and have an end. And then if you get to 4 seasons or 5 seasons, get it done. Get it over with. Maybe move to a movie, maybe move to a spin-off or whatever. Just end it. Because in America, there is the tradition of trying to keep shows going. But some shows jump the shark. That is an old phrase from the old TV show Happy Days, where one of the main characters, Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz, gets on a water ski and jumps the shark. That's where the term comes from. The show was never the same after that. There are many tropes throughout there. Adding the new character, the young little character on a sitcom, the adopted son or daughter or whatever, and that almost inevitably spells doom for the show. Sometimes when a show is losing momentum, the best thing you can do is just go ahead and end it. Because no matter what you do, when it starts losing appeal, it's awfully hard to get that appeal back. And almost impossible. And sometimes the best thing you can do is wrap it up. Announce that this will be the last season, pique some interest in it, wrap it up, maybe move to a movie down the road. So, yeah, that is my holy trinity. I could go into bigger detail later another time. I probably will. I'm thinking about maybe going and doing a rewatch of all 3 of these series along with other shows. I've done some for Babylon 5, just the first 2 episodes as well as the original pilot. You can find it on my John Thomas Hill show podcast. I will probably redo them at another time because I didn't like them too much. I liked them, but they weren't as good as I'd liked them to be. I'll leave it that much. Here's what I'm planning on doing in the near future. I'm going to probably kind of do rewatches. I'll do like an episode here of one show, do another episode there, and kind of try and get episodes into where I focus on the episode itself. I'm going to do Babylon 5 I'll definitely do. Expanse I'll do, because I've only watched a few episodes of that. And I really need to get into Man in the High Castle, which is somewhat science fiction-y. It's alternate history style, and we'll probably do that sometime in the near future. So, I hope you enjoyed this. I just wanted to kind of do this off the cuff because I wanted to put something on here and let you know that, yes, I am still paying attention to the channel. If you've gotten this far, thank you very much for tuning in. I just want to share my thoughts about this. It probably wasn't the most cognitive way of doing things because this is literally off the cuff. I have no notes in front of me because sometimes I like to riff. But I'm sort of developing an idea of what I want this podcast to be, as well as the other podcast I'm doing. Briefly tell you about them. The John Thomas Hill show is mainly going to be more of a personal blog / about current events, stuff like that. not hardcore politics or anything like that, although there'll be some of that to a degree. That's mainly going to be meant for my middle-of-the-road podcast, which I'm sort of developing because I'm not necessarily a Democrat, but I'm not a Republican either. Although I do lean more left than right, I'm not entirely a liberal. I'll have to explain it in time. I'm kind of figuring out what I want to do with that podcast. There is my sports podcast called Rutherford Sports Network. And that one is the one I'll be doing. And plus I've got to do a podcast real soon about that because we've got sports going on. I got to do one about college football, probably sometime either later today or tomorrow one. I'm not sure yet because I got to work tomorrow. But stay tuned because we've got some very good things coming up. I've got some folks who I want to see if they can record some stuff like I'm going to see if I can get my friend Todd to do a rewatch of all the Star Wars movies and record it as he's watching them and give his thoughts and impressions and commentary through that, maybe along with his son Canyon. I would like to see that happen. But anyhow, that is it for now. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you have a great day.